Enlighten our minds and hearts, O God, by the working of your Spirit, that we may be brought into that fullness of truth promised us by your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. You know, there's some people that think that pastors, ministers, preachers only work a couple hours on Sunday. Well, that's not really true. If I'm going to have anything to say to you on Sunday morning, it takes a little longer than that. And this week was one of those funny weeks. I've changed this sermon at least 3 times. Because every time I thought I had you look for a hook, something that is going to hit, and it changed 3 times. The first time it happened was I am in a Bible study, not really a Bible study, a lectionary study every Tuesday, and we're all progressive pastors. We are, serve churches in the most part that are middle to left, of center and so forth and so on. So we got in this big discussion concerning this text this morning about the idea of enough. And I thought, yeah, we could talk about how much is enough. How much do you have to have and call it enough? Well, within a couple of days I dropped that because I got thinking, when I start thinking about enough, that's still trying to put the whole question in my hands, instead of listening to what God would have. So that's when I came up with this title about how big is your barn? And she brought a little part of her barn this morning. We all have them, don't we? You got a barn? We have some of this fun. I've told you before, when I moved out of my big house and moved into a 1-bedroom apartment, and that was on purpose because I wanted to get rid of stuff. And it's amazing how much stuff I didn't get rid of, and stuff that I look at and say, well, am I ever going to read that book again? Well, probably not, but I ought to have that one on my shelf, So I got thinking about that and how big was my barn, and I thought, well, that doesn't really get at it either. And then as I watched the news through the week, that started to work on my mind. And then another thing that was working on it was I had a request from somebody in the congregation, I won't tell you who, to know more about some things about Africa. And I thought, well, I learned a lot in the time I spent in East Africa. And there's a quotation from a man that I may have mentioned to you before. His name is Carlo Carretto. Books are still in print. He was a hermit in the desert for much of his life. And what I do is when I see something that really speaks to me from other writers and spiritual writers and so forth, I write them in pages in my Bible. Well, this is a Carlo Carretto, and it's one that I'll tell you, it will bug you if you let it. He wrote, all the complications of modern life, especially a rich one, are full of poison. And they take people away from the gospel and make them sad. That's hard to hear, isn't it? So the subtitle of How Big is Your Barn is Privilege. Do you know how privileged you are? Now think about this a minute. You got up this morning. You're here, I assume you got up. You had to decide some things, didn't you? What to wear. What I'm going to have for breakfast. What's going on later? What do the kids need? What does my wife or my husband need? All those kind of little things. Don't even think about it. Shall I have cereal or eggs? What should, all of that stuff. Those are only the kind of questions that get asked if you're a person of privilege. You have choices like that. You're talking about your closet. You're not alone in your closet. Guys, come on. You've got some shirts and stuff that you wouldn't let anybody get rid of if they put a gun to your head, We've all got stuff. And it's because we're so privileged. It's hard for us to get the distance we need to understand it when we look at the news. I don't know about you, but it's a hard thing to get up from supper and then go in and watch the film about Gaza, isn't it? I don't want to be political. That's awfully hard when you've got somebody who wants to build a golden ballroom and children don't have flour to make bread. It's hard. So I want to tell you a couple of Africa stories. There's a big town in Kenya called Nairobi. A couple million people in that town. And they'd like to show you that stuff on tourist, sites, and you can go and take it, you can sign up and go and spend several $1,000s and going, and they show you these beautiful hotels, and all that stuff. They don't show you what the Kibera slum, over 1 million people there. You don't even want to know what's in the water that runs down the middle of the streets in that town, or watch the children pick through the garbage. Done that. We were in southern Kenya for a conference. I was traveling around all that part of Kenya, and it was right down on the border with Tanzania. And one of the things we were doing, us white privileged folks, Europeans and Americans, because of the travel we were involved in that particular year, we decided a good thing would be is if whenever we went someplace and the kind of money we would raise would be for the planting of trees. That's a good idea, isn't it? Plant trees, because we knew all this all the jets and cars and trains and everything, and what that does to the environment, so we ought to plant some trees. That's a good thing. So we had crossed over, like I said, into Tanzania, and we were walking. We had a couple of little tiny trees we were going to plant. Walking out of the church, they call them meeting houses there, and was walking by, and here was a little hut made of mud and grass. And there was a woman sitting out there, and on her lap was a little girl, looked like she was about 3. And I looked over, and so I thought, well, what are you going to do? So I walked over to her, and I said, "Do you speak English?" And yes, she spoke English, so that was something. And I said, "What's the little girl's name?" And she said, "Emma." Well, this is before I had a granddaughter named Emma, so that I just thought it was a neat name. And I said, "Emma, do you want to help me?" And so Emma gave me her hand, and we walked over, and she helped me plant a tree. And I said, "Now, Emma, this is your tree. You have to come out here and you have to water it and make sure that it's taken care of. So that's your job, Emma, is to take care of this tree." I can't tell that story around my daughter because she starts going, "Woo," making this big crying noise whenever she hears that story. That was one story about Tanzania. Another time we crossed over into Uganda from Western Kenya, and I used to kid people and so forth, if you think it's primitive in the countryside in Kenya, I said, go to Uganda or Tanzania and you go back another 20 or 25 years as far as what's available and so forth. We were at a school a place called Sabusi in Uganda. And it was in the early 2000s, and so there was still quite a bit of worry, and there still is there, about HIV and AIDS. And so the children in this school, especially the girls who were about 13 or 14 years old, and they pretty much stayed at the school because it wasn't safe for them to travel from where they lived to the school, because there was this terrible, terrible misunderstanding about some people that if you slept with a virgin, it would cure your AIDS. And so these girls were in danger whenever they walked to school. And they presented us with a little dance. They did a dance. And it was a beautiful thing to watch, and so forth. And these young women and so forth. And they explained to us that this was an AIDS dance. An AIDS dance. A year later, I got a note from Sabuse School, because they had a grade school as well, up through what we would think of as middle school. And there had been storms. We're used to that, right? There had been these storms. The school buildings were made of mud and straw, and half of them had been destroyed by the rain. Some roofs had fallen in and killed a dozen children. Hard to take, isn't it? I was in Tanzania again, and I may have told you this story. Forgive me if you've heard it already, but it's a great story. We had been there all day, and we were going back to southern Kenya that evening, and there were people waiting for us in Kenya for us to arrive, and they'd waited supper. I think I said something about when I talked about hospitality. I think I told that story. What I didn't tell you was that maybe there was a boy there, about 12 years old, with an older man. And I was just tired, just tired. And so what I wanted to do was eat whatever they put in front of you, because you have to do that. You can't not eat what they put in front of you. And then I went to bed. Next morning, he's still there, and this older man, and they had walked from Tanzania 3 days. And they said that they came because I was going to be there. And the thing was, an American pastor, this young boy, 12 or 13, had felt the call to ministry. His family had no money, no way that he could pay for an education, even though the Quakers have a school in Kenya, a seminary. No way he could ever afford that. So, and the man who was with him was his pastor, who was about 75 years old. You can imagine this, 12-year-old kid walking through Africa with an old man. And what they wanted to know is, and so the question is, what should I do? No pressure, right? Thinking fast. I said, is this man your pastor? He said, yes. I said, are you learning from him? The boy said, yes. I said, well, you stay with him and you learn as much as you can about ministry from him. And when he can't teach you anything else, you find somebody else to follow around. And when you can't learn any more from that one. And they were going to walk back then 3 days to Tanzania. We gave them a ride. We gave them a ride in the Land Rover we had. When you're in situations like that, and like I said, those don't have to be Africa. You don't have to leave Clinton County for some of that. You know the story about the original Bobby Kennedy, not the current guy, the original Bobby Kennedy. The Kennedys had a lot of money, still do. And he was beginning to run for president, and he was always known as the Kennedys' Rottweiler, because he was the guy you turned all the hard stuff over to, and he would attack. He's the guy who did in Jimmy Hoffa, and all of those kind of things. Well, he was on beginning his tours of running for president, and they went to a place, I don't remember I think it was in a city someplace, and he couldn't believe the way the children had to live. When he went home that night, he had that big family, all those kids, and they had plenty. He was unable to eat his supper. And it changed him. If you know anything about the Kennedys and so forth, know anything about Bobby Kennedy, he was a different guy the last 6 months of his life. He was a different guy. And that's part of what changed him. What helps us to understand the difference between having enough, which we can kind of control sometimes, and we all know that there's not a person in this room, I don't know all your circumstances, there's not a person in this room that, comparatively speaking, doesn't have enough. Don't we? Got enough. Jesus didn't say there's anything wrong with that, did he? He didn't say there's anything wrong with this man having a good crop. There's nothing wrong with having too much zucchini. I was teasing somebody this morning. I said, you used to have enough zucchini, you put it in bags, and then at midnight you go around to your neighbors and leave bags of zucchini on their porches. You've got so much darn zucchini. I don't know if that ever happens with eggs or not. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe we're going to have eggs next week. It's difficult. It's difficult when we have enough. What do you do with it? You've read the stuff in the press, haven't you, about the man who was a former faculty person at the Wilmington College? You heard about the gift? $23 million he left to the college. I think, oh my God, college professor, there's got to be more to this professor stuff than I know. No, about in the 70s, and when everything was going so well, he bought a lot of stock in things like Apple and never touched it. And it sat there for all of these years, 50 years. That's why he had that money. That isn't the whole story. He was also a coach at Wilmington College. And he kept a list of all the students that he had coached. And towards the end of his life, he got that list out and got their addresses and wrote each one of them a note, a card, and so forth, with a check for $1,000 for each one. And then my daughter told me the other day, you know, the 23 million wasn't all of it. He had another 20 million that he gave away to food banks. What did he do with all that money that he had accumulated? Gave it away. Gave it away. All of it. It makes us think about, how do we raise our children? College is one of those examples. Why do you want your kids, if possible, to go to college? Why do you want to do that? For a better life, right? But you see, that gets translated so many times in our modern culture into more secure life, more money, and so forth, which is not the purpose of higher education, you know. It's not the purpose. When I went to college seminary, the difference in our college seminary was that the people who ran that, the monks who developed that college, they had decided that they wanted it not just to be a seminary, they wanted us all to get a true undergraduate college education. So we had to take all of that stuff. God, I took 2 languages. Latin because I had to, and French because you had to have a modern foreign language. And you had to take all the science and the biology. I remember cutting up frogs, you know, and you take all that stuff and political science and all of those kind of classes that you take and so forth. And what their understanding was, in order to be a rounded person, not because you were going to make any money, because we were all studying to be priests, and I'll tell you, somebody who didn't have any money usually is a vowed priest, but so that our lives would be fuller. But you see, even that is privilege. How do we connect with not having privilege? How do we ask ourselves, as people who have plenty of barns and plenty of stuff in them, even when we don't think we do, how do we deal with this text? Well, the first thing you look at is, and you understand that Jesus said, I'm not the one who decides what you're supposed to do with it. Don't come to me and ask Jesus, how is it that I'm supposed to spend my money? How am I supposed to split it up with the rest of my family? How am I supposed to do it anyway? He says, who made me the arbiter of this stuff? That's not my job, Jesus says. It goes back to our business last week about what do you pray for? We all know the joke about, you know, the person who says, oh Lord, just let me win the lottery. You know, and I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing. And you know it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. That's what's unusual about the man who gave all that money to the college, is that he willingly gave it away. I was reading another book. I don't read just holy and learned things, do you? I mean, I like to have a lot of fun, and one of the things I have fun with is John Grisham. The books of John Grisham. Now, I was reading one a week ago and so forth about a man who had $10 billion. That's you can't even imagine that. And he had all these children. And each one of the children, when they turned 21, had received $5 million. But none of them were close to him. As a matter of fact, they were all stinkers. The money had helped to ruin him, and he had never been around. What they didn't know as they sat there for the reading of the will while he was still alive is that he had written out another one. Faked his signature on the one where they thought they were going to get all this money, and he had written out a handwritten will, left them nothing, and said if they contested it, they wouldn't even get what little they thought they were going to get. And he left it all to his illegitimate daughter, who was a missionary in Brazil. $10 billion. The story is that the lawyer goes to find her and has a terrible time trying to find her. And she doesn't want anything to do with it. She doesn't want the money. She doesn't even want to sign the paperwork that's going to turn it over to somebody else. She doesn't want anything to do with the whole idea of that money. At the end of the book, she dies of malaria, having nothing to do with $10 billion. I'll tell you, in a Grisham novel, if you ever read any of those, it messed everybody up. None of them could believe that. Well, it's hard for me to believe, too. Because one of the questions that was asked of her, think what you could do with that in the missionary world. She didn't even want to touch it, to get involved with it that way, because she knew what that would do to her spiritually. So what about us? Now, this isn't something that I'm trying to get us all to go out and sell everything we've got and go and join Carlo Corretto in the desert of Arabia someplace and so forth. There are people who need to do that. There are people who are called to do that as a witness to the rest of us. But what are you called into doing? Instead of building a bigger barn, instead of teaching our children that the value of life is building bigger barns, and we do that every day. Get a job, get a better job, get an education, do this, that. Why? Why, Daddy? So that you'll have a better life, so that you can have a bigger barn. And I don't think I know I didn't spend near enough time with my daughter and my nephews and nieces talking about what's of real value and how you do that. The things that we do, the barns that we have, the stuff that we accumulate, the kinds of things that are just part of our natural sort of business about teaching each other and our children about a better life, they're all involved with not just enough, but more than enough, and just having it so we feel secure, and yet we miss what Jesus says. Yeah, right. How about tomorrow morning when you're not even here anymore? Then what? What's all that worth then? A good memory? Some of you say, oh, Dad or Grandpa or Grandma or Mom, they were a good person. Well, that's nice. I have a friend of mine who, a Quaker, and I don't know if you know who William Penn was. That's where you have Pennsylvania. He was an early Quaker. And so when he's buried in England, and I remember my friend standing at William Penn's grave, who's been this very famous man, William Penn, stood at the grave and looked down at the stone that was there and so forth, and kind of wiped it off a little bit, and he says, you know, regardless of who you are, the birds get the last word. What's of real value? How do we let go of trying to convince ourselves that what we need is, well, just enough, Lord? When I say just enough, Lord, you see, I'm leaving it in my hands. I'm not really depending upon Christ to deal with it. Now, that doesn't mean let's all go home and quit our jobs and get rid of all of our stuff and quit raising our kids and go and move into the homeless shelter. That isn't what that means. What it means is that with the things that you have, the things that are part of your life, the things that you value and so forth, are gifts of God. They're not entirely your responsibility, and there's no such thing as worrying about enough, because that tries to put me in charge of it. How do I turn all that over to God? How do I let loose of it? One exercise is to have a good clear out, as they say in England. That's one way. But there's the deeper way. The closer we get to Jesus, the more we realize how big our barns really are, and how much of that is really part of who we are becoming in Christ, and how much of that is keeping us from Him. It's hard, and it's an individual question for each one of us, regardless of our circumstance. And it's hard for us because we have so much privilege. We have so much that we don't even think about it 80% of the time.